By the summer of 1941, Camp 21 Comrie, also known as Cultybraggan Camp, had emerged on land south of the Perthshire village. Built between May and October that year by 249 Alien Company Pioneer Corps, it was constructed by mainly German and Austrian Jewish refugees. They laid the foundations and erected the barbed wire fencing which surrounded it. Its first prisoner is said to have been a soldier from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders who had gone absent without leave to see his pregnant girlfriend. Originally, it was to be a training camp for British soldiers, but its role changed following the arrival of a large swathe of prisoners of war captured during the North Africa campaign in 1943. The first prisoners were Italians, but Germans arrived that year. These were professional soldiers, but like the Italians, sang their hearts out as they marched from Comrie railway station to the camp, some 2 miles away. In May 1944, the camp was a transit one where the prisoners were moved on to other camps. The camp leader at the time was Oberfeldwebel Martens and his adjutant, Stabswebel Hummel. Although the camp had capacity for 4,500 prisoners, only around 785 were held at the time. These consisted of 670 army combatants from the Luftwaffe and the U-boats, 115 protected personnel such as doctors, teachers and ministers, and a handful of officers. Of these, 50% were non-commissioned officers, NCOs, and about 25% were protected personnel from the medical profession. It was split into 4 large compounds, made up mainly of Nissen huts, but living conditions were fairly primitive. A hospital had been allocated space just outside the camp that same month, with a German doctor responsible for the 30-bed infirmary, along with his assistant, who was in charge of its smooth running. A senior British medical officer was responsible for the medical service, along with the commandant, and he had a good rapport with the German medical officers. In December that year, the infirmary expanded to hold 40 beds, and there was now also a dispensary, toilets available to those who were ill, and bedrooms for clinicians. Most of the rooms by then had electric lighting and central heating, although one room was still heated by a stove. More prisoners arrived following the Normandy landings on 6 June 1944, taking the total number to just under 3,000. The 4 original compounds holding Germans and Italians were still in place, with Compound E having been introduced. This new compound held what were termed foreigners. Each compound had a leader to oversee its smooth running. These leaders were Oberfeldwebel Martens for Compound A, which held 630, Oberfeldwebel Gunther for Compound B, which held just over 100 men, Stabsfeldwebel Hummel for Compound C, which held 1,000 men, 700 of which had been sent from Camp 24 at Loch Gilphead in Argyll, and Stabswebel Gorholt for Compound D, which held just over 850 men. 6 months later, the camp was almost at capacity, holding 3,980. On 20th December, the 7th Polish Guard Company took up their posts, replacing some of the British Guards. At this time, 9 men were being held in the detention block for the murder of fellow prisoner of war, Feldwebel Wolfgang Rosterg, the case which has brought Camp 21 infamy. All the prisoners were now German, and all were housed in Nissen huts. The food rations for the prisoners were the same as those given to the British troops, but the prisoners had complaints. For one thing, they didn't receive vegetables, which they liked, and for another, they found the meat to be fatty. Sausages were bulked out with bread, and they thought there was too little sugar available. They also complained they didn't receive onions. On the upside, they did have salt and pepper, mustard and curry powder, and each prisoner had his own set of cutlery and crockery with which to eat. By the early summer of 1945, the men had been allocated 10 ounces of bread per man per day, but the Germans still complained it wasn't enough, having been more used to the heavier rye bread or black bread back home. They requested at least 16 ounces per day. The camp's limitations were still apparent that summer, as some of the men had to eat their meals in their hut, because there were not enough tables and chairs in the dining room, meaning the chefs had to prepare the food 3 times in quick succession. Work at the camp was non-existent to begin with, although there was a call for it. This meant money was unavailable, but ingeniously, there was another system in place. This was a credit system on pieces of card, so if the prisoners went to the canteen, they could get items and purchases would be debited onto their card. However, there was no canteen at Camp 21, as the local NAFI, Navy, Army and Air Force institutes had not been informed of the arrival of the men. On the instructions of the War Office, with all the NAFI furniture being uniform, it was hoped the canteen would be up and running before too long, after the furniture was requested. Leisure time was spent playing football nearly every day on the large sports ground within the compound, and education courses began. But there was a problem, namely a lack of paper. As an improvisatory measure, toilet paper was used instead. The accounts office too was desperate for paper and tried to expedite the delivery of stationery, but there was a lack of willingness on the part of the British officers within the camp. And because it was a transit camp, with the expectation that the men would stay no longer than 3 months, there was also no provision made for the long term. The men made games and model aeroplanes and tanks from wood and metal, using old cans to pass the time. The library was stocked with books, so reading became a favourite pastime. And educational classes were also extended. For example, in Compound A, the classes offered included English, navigation and stenography. In Compound B, French, as well as accountancy and maths. Compound C offered maths, arithmetic, French, German and English. And Compound D offered botany, agriculture and literature. But they didn't have the luxury of books, or paper for that matter. The prisoners could listen to the radio but only the BBC and musical programmes. An amateur theatre group was also set up. Mail was slow in getting through to the camp. The majority of prisoners had not received anything since their capture in North Africa more than a year earlier. What they did receive were cigarettes, tobacco, razor blades, as well as shaving cream, boxes of matches, and tubes of toothpaste. In the early summer of 1945, the camp was under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Kennedy Wilson. Wilson, a former police officer who was called up and given command of the Comrie camp on 27th March that year, made many improvements. Flower beds had been laid out and paths had been constructed. Protected personnel were now allowed on walks and discipline was good, although there was the exception at Christmas 1944, when a homemade swastika was flown over the camp. Some of the huts were subdivided to cater for barbers' rooms and first aid posts, and the sanitary conditions were improved. There was only cold water in the washrooms, and a hot shower was only available once a week, but it was still an improvement. Clothes were all washed in cold water. Another improvement was the theatre group and orchestra. Each compound had its own theatre group, with all kinds of improvised materials for the costumes and scenery. The orchestra of Compound A was known as the DTC, the Deutsches Theater Comrie, and had 8 members. They held a concert on the afternoon of Sunday 10th June at the camp infirmary, where they played exceedingly well. The next commandant of Camp 21 was 45-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Darcy Evelyn Mills Fielding of the York and Lancaster Regiment. When he was in charge, in November 1945, there were fewer than 850 men in the camp, with only Compounds C and D holding them, although Compounds A and B were expecting an influx in the near future, as many of the prisoners had been transferred to other camps. Of those left, only 25 had been captured before D-Day, the rest afterwards. Some of the prisoners were now allowed to work in agriculture locally and in the construction of buildings, earning a penny halfpenny an hour. And at long last, there was now a canteen in each compound, with a fund of £250 available. On 16th May 1946, the Red Cross's Inspector Bondelli wrote that Camp 21 was a very good, well-run camp. Compounds A and B now each housed 1,000 prisoners who were in transit from the United States to other camps, or who were about to be repatriated. Their stay was scheduled to last only 2 or 3 weeks, and in all, just under 3,500 men were held, the vast majority German. Like so many other prisoner of war camps, Camp 21 had its share of escape attempts. A Compound C sergeant who was decorated with the Knight's Cross, a high military honour in Germany, decided to make a bid for freedom. He managed to breach the security, but within 24 hours he was found, hidden in a haystack, and promptly brought back. On 10th March 1945, 3 prisoners managed to escape and went on the run. 2 days later, they were recaptured and returned. Camp guards also discovered a number of tunnels. The first of these, found on 9th April 1945 in Compound B, one in the compound and another in a compound storehouse. It was found behind a bookcase in the library, and the Commandant ordered a search of every man's bunk until the perpetrators were found. On 27th April, another one was found, but it was only in its very early stages. Wilson had become suspicious as he had noticed a pile of earth consisting of various colours of soil getting larger over a period of weeks. Following its discovery, the perpetrators were exposed. They all had yellowish-brown soil underneath their fingernails and were duly sent to the detention block. However, most prisoners had no real interest in escaping into the wild Scottish countryside. Camp 21 closed its doors to prisoners of war not long after the cessation of World War II, with all 2,000 prisoners removed in 5 batches on the same day in May 1947. It later became a territorial army camp. There is evidence that Camp 21A, the Cowden camp, which opened in early 1945 to house a 500 overflow of prisoners, was a Polish resettlement camp between 20th August 1946 and 31st August 1948, as hinted at by the written testimony of Major John August's son, David. August, from the Welsh Regiment, was posted at Comrie at this time to a Polish camp and given a Polish shield when he was transferred. Its life as a military training camp came to an end when the Army decided to close it in 2004. Within its grounds is a Royal Observer Corps post and a Cold War bunker, which would have housed the Scottish office in the event of a nuclear attack. It was never used. Today the camp is community owned by the Comrie Development Trust, and the bunker was bought by Bogans Limited, a technology firm, in May 2014. As for the commandants, Wilson died in January 1962, while Fielding passed away in Surrey in 1988.